Hello, my name is Sophia Close, and I'm the Senior Advisor Gender and Peace Building at Conciliation Resources. Diana Tremino, the Head of Program Support and the Senior Gender Advisor at Safe World, and I will act as your moderators today. We welcome all participants. On behalf of Conciliation Resources and Safer World, I'm so pleased to welcome you to our panel discussion titled Gender Sensitive Conflict Analysis, Impact and Lessons from Yemen and Nigeria. This webinar will launch our new guide and provide clear examples of why this approach is critical for effective and strategic policy and programming. To start, I would like to introduce Paul Murphy, the Executive Director of Safer World. Over to you, Paul. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophia, and may I add a warm welcome to everybody to our discussion this afternoon. It's a real honor for me to co-host this event with Conciliation Resources, which reflects really a partnership that we've had for a number of years now and working together on some of these issues in trying to advance peace building as an inclusive approach and one where international practice on gender sensitivity around conflict analysis can be mainstreamed more and more across our field. I suppose what's really noteworthy in terms of the launching of our framework and tool and ideas about how we can promote this work is that we've just passed the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And in truth, there are many concerns about where we are at the global level in terms of trying to fulfill this ambitious agenda over time. Right now, I think there's a feeling that in the bigger context, a sense of a pushback against gender equality in some areas and women's rights in racial equality, fueled sometimes by violence, sometimes violent masculinities in certain contexts, and also policies and laws in some contexts where sexual and reproductive health or sexual and gender minorities are put under pressure. We've seen those as in near countries such as Poland or maybe further away in the US. But also I think we have to acknowledge that this year in particular, the influence of the global pandemic, the COVID-19, has also brought another dimension to our whole understanding and reflection in this area. I think, like with lots of other things, COVID-19 has aggravated gender inequality and sadly increased to shocking levels of gender-based violence against women and sexual and gender minorities around the world. This is in many different contexts, which is kind of adding to the sense of a backsliding around equitable opportunities for women and for youth and for minorities so that they can access and play a part with decision makers and in decision-making places across the world. These gender dynamics, of course, are particularly evident in places where there is a lot of instability and conflict, and especially where gender norms are being seen to be undermined in contexts where militarization and securitization in those contexts has made life even more difficult. And it's not just, young people, young men joining armed groups and violent groups, but also a sense of something that's more systemic and more mainstreamed in places where there's a strong conflict and economy of war. But in all cases, what we're seeing is a heightened levels of gender-based violence, while at the same time, women are having to take on extra responsibilities for their well-being and basic needs in such situations. I think the point being really that in all of these contexts, we know that there is a direct correlation between these high levels of gender inequality and gender-based violence and the conflict that is happening. And that if we are actually to be part of any transformative agenda in these contexts, then it's about also involving women in political and peace processes and ensuring that they have a chance to play a much more important role, a more inclusive role around sustainable results. And this is why the tools that we're going to discuss in a moment here, I think are really relevant and pertinent. Because as we mark this landmark UN Security Resolution 1325, we're actually looking for new and fresh ways where we can take this agenda more to communities And the tools that we will discuss and the ideas and the frameworks that are presented in it are really there to help all of us to play a much more active role in that going forward. I look forward to the full presentation in terms of what we have to offer and what we would like people to engage with, and then also the conversation that will follow in terms about how these can be put to useful and good work in the context where all of you are working. So welcome again, and look forward to our discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We really appreciate your introductory remarks. Recognising that this work has been strongly supported by the UK government, our next speaker is Joelle Jenny, who is the Director of the Joint Funds Unit in the Cabinet Secretariat, which oversees the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund and the Prosperity Fund for the UK government. Thanks, Joelle. Over to you.
Thing that, you know, has been talked about very often, but we don't always see that genuinely happening and making a difference. So our priority is we want to achieve that breakthrough in analysis and making sure that it's a gendered perspective, not only sort of in terms of the drivers of conflict, what it means for women, for gender in general, but also because we know that it improves, you know, it can be a source of resilience in conflict. We want to also challenge the work, you know, that's perceived as successful to date. I think the definitions of success have often been a bit complacent, and with a gendered sort of analysis, we can get much more sort of in depth in understanding sort of what insecurity looks like. Who experiences it, what security means and to whom, and sort of ultimately who has the power to influence, and therefore, you know, where should we be focusing our efforts, our engagements, our partnership. And the third sort of really critical thing we're aiming to achieve is really to forge alliances with non-traditional actors. And I think COVID has really demonstrated again, you know, the role that sort of women organizations can play in the response. We want to really reach out to, you know, a wider diversity of actors. And again, that's where, you know, we do need the analytical tools that enable us to go deeper into understanding what's happening. So we're currently developing a gender strategy for the CSSF. We've recruited also the expertise to really do it, because I think one of the risks is, you know, everybody talks about gender, but it gets a bit confused. There's a lack of precision in the use of the terms. And again, I think that's where this work is helping us, because it gets everybody on the same page and we can be much more exact about what it is that needs to happen. And that's the work we're currently doing. We've got activity in Nigeria, supporting women in Yemen, in Georgia. I'm very happy to go into more detail about that, but I know you're keen that the sort of introductory presentation are short so that we have the time for the Q&A. So I'll stop here for now, and I'm really happy to come back, and more than anything, I look forward to hearing the contributions of the other panelists.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Joelle. We really appreciate your support and encouragement. The next speaker is Hester Gronewald. She's an independent consultant with over 20 years experience in gender, peace and conflict work, and is one of the guide's co-authors. Over to you, Hester.
Thank you, Sophia, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this webinar. It's really exciting for us as the authors to be launching this after all the work we've put into it. And we hope it will be a useful methodology for everyone. And thanks also to Paul and Joelle for that introduction. I think, you know, the recognition that some important progress has been made in the last 20 years, but there's still pushback happening, as we saw with the Russian-led resolution a few weeks ago. But we know that when we talk about gender equality and the participation of women, these are not luxuries to peace building. These are in fact crucial if we're trying to be successful in building inclusive and long-term peace. So the guide that we're launching properly today is intended to be useful to practitioners and policymakers alike. And it provides exercises for those who want to be gender sensitive, but also those who want to go further and be gender transformative or gender responsive. In other words, for those who really want to address the structural causes of gender inequality and violence as well. When we first started thinking about this methodology, it was really born out of frustration that most conflict analysis methodologies did not include gender in a really meaningful way. So some included gender-related questions, but for us as practitioners working with people around the world, it felt difficult to really make these gender-related questions a core part of the methodology and the analysis process, rather than just having them as a sort of checklist on the side. For me, the insight that really launched the process for developing this methodology was when I worked with a colleague who was new and who had lots of gender mainstreaming experience, but didn't have a grounding in conflict analysis tools per se. And so we were discussing how do we make gender and conflict links more concrete, more explicit for our peace building colleagues. And we initially framed our exploration of this topic around the ABC triangle conflict analysis tool that many of you will be familiar with. Basically, that triangle talks about how when you look at the behavior that fuels conflict and violence, that's only one part of the three tips of the triangle. And underneath the surface, you have individual attitudes that inform that behavior. And you also have systems and structures in the context that support that type of action to be happening. And so when we think about gender inequality, it's a similar dynamic. The behavior that we see at the top of the triangle is the visible tip, but it's underlined by bigger system that comprises these individual discriminatory attitudes from people, but also a broader context that entrenches discrimination and exclusion that's based on gender. So that was sort of our first insight, but then to turn this into a process that people can use, we decided to go with the systems analysis methodology because conflicts are so complex, and integrating gender profoundly into a conflict and peace analysis really requires thinking about multi-directional and multi-layered dynamics. At the same time, the systems approach also allows for bringing the issues together in a structured and visual way, which we felt was important for practitioners, and to identify leverage points. Now, these are points where one change to this whole system can actually cause a ripple effect and cause the whole system to change. This again was important for us because as practitioners and with our colleagues, we've often struggled with conflict analysis methodologies that give you long list of conflict issues and peace opportunities, but don't give you the tools to help to prioritize how do you engage with this and how do you work on it. And so we worked with CDA's conflict systems analysis methodology, which I'm sure lots of people know. And we used exercises from the CR and Safe World toolkits on gender and conflict analysis to enrich the gender element of that. True to CR and Safe World's way of working, we really designed the guide as a tool for participatory analysis. And this is particularly important when we're trying to understand gender norms in the context alongside our usual questions around what's happening in conflict and peace dynamics. So in terms of the structure of the guide, it starts with information about how to design the process to ensure that there could be meaningful participation of all the participants, especially women, but everyone else as well. And this is important because both conflict and gender remain sensitive topics and are potentially increasingly sensitive in many contexts. So the guide highlights a range of issues from everybody's safety through to organizing group exercises in a way that maximizes women's ability to contribute even in restrictive environments. So that whole setup is important. The guide sets out a 3-day workshop agenda. It can be adapted, it can be expanded, and it then runs through a process where first we sort of set the foundation around understanding and identifying gender norms and intersectionality, and we do that through very accessible group exercises. And then we delve into the main concepts of conflict, peace, and violence, and how gender flows through each of these. Next slide, please, Julia. So once we've done that foundation, we really launch into the steps. And I hope it's a bit bigger on your screen than on mine. But the first step is really to sit down and brainstorm what are the gender sensitive conflict and peace factors that influence this conflict affected context we're in. And then from there, we have a conversation about selecting gender sensitive key driving factors, which are the factors that really seem to connect to lots of different elements. And if you change that, everything else would also change. And then just the next slide, please, Julia, just to show that once you've done that analysis with the key driving factors, you start breaking it down into little loops. And I'm running through this quite quickly. It's too complex to run through the whole methodology in the webinar. But just to show you an example that when you start making these loops about how the causes and effects of this key driving factor come together in reinforcing loops. That's the start of your systems map. And then you end up in step 3 with, next slide please, Julia, with this crazy diagram that shows you a full systems map that has gender really integrated across the whole board. Now, once you have that map, and I promise it makes sense when you go through the process yourself, you then can start putting the actors on. So you then start asking yourself, who are the actors who can really steer the situation, the system towards peace or to continue fueling conflict and violence? And then when all of that is on the map, you can really step back and go, right, where are the leverage points? How do we engage with this? And how do we support change in this whole system? So the guide has many tips and resources, including detailed handouts to help facilitators encourage deep thinking about gender throughout the workshop. And the aim is really that the analysis and the discussions can move beyond exclusively thinking about the impacts of conflict and peace on women, which is important, but also really interrogating how gender norms and gender-related issues could be drivers of conflict or building blocks for peace. The analysis workshop itself could be used as an intervention in its own right, or it can be used as the basis for designing new policy or programming work, and you can pitch it at the level that you need to pitch it. I've personally found it really enriching to see how participants engage with this methodology from contexts as diverse as Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, Libya, and Pakistan. And we'll hear more examples later. But just to give you a sense, in Yemen and Libya, we worked with women's rights activists who were very engaged on the WPS agenda, but they did not all have a grounding in conflict analysis. And so they found this methodology really useful to deepen their analysis on the sort of conflict side. But at the same time, they brought real depth to the gender part of the analysis because they were approaching it with a feminist lens. And the issues they came up with, I have not really heard from other peace building practitioner groups that I've worked with before. So one example, for instance, is in Yemen, the group articulated how the active women's movement in 2015 was neutralized as a political force by the armed groups who were dominated by powerful men and who used gender norms to get women off the streets and thus out of the political space. So workshop participants also pointed out that on top of that, as the conflict continued, these armed groups were supported by regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who hold the same restrictive gender norms. And so they reproduced the acceptability of excluding women and prioritizing military solutions to the next level, to the regional and international level. Another group of practitioners working with this methodology in South Sudan, they selected gender-based violence as a key driving factor for conflict. And this was because of the damages that it does to society as a whole, but also for how it deepened ethnic divisions and how it increased the risks of retaliatory violence in specific communities. So in my view, this type of analysis only really emerged when we applied this methodology because we deeply integrated gender across every step. And so that enabled participants as they went through it to unveil how gender and conflict dynamics are part of the same systems of exclusion, contest for power, and violence. So to conclude, about 20 years ago, when I asked a peace-building colleague why we were not working on gender in a particular context, he responded that if gender was an issue in this conflict, it would have come up. Now, I think as peace-building practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, we know that the questions we ask to a large degree determine the issues that come up. So with this guide, we hope we can contribute to making sure that not only does gender always come up in our work, but we actually deepen our practice in a way that draws on gendered analysis to build inclusive and lasting peace. Thank you, Sophia. Back to you.
Thank you, Hester. That was a really rich, quick journey through the process that we do. We're now going to turn to 3 colleagues who have participated in the methodology themselves in the workshops and have taken the work forward in different ways in their own practice. The first speaker to discuss this is Alfa Al-Nami. Alfa is Safer World's Yemeni country manager, and she also has a very strong gender background. So over to you, Alfa.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Julia, and thanks for the attendees for giving us this opportunity. Let me start with sharing an image with you. So imagine this one, a diwan full of sheikhs, leaders, local authorities, all men. It's a space just designed for men. They are shouting, yelling at each other, few fire shots in the background between the guards. They all stopped and witnessed a group of women entering this male-only space and proposing a solution for what's been a 30-years-old conflict around water spring between several villages in Taz, Sabra al-Mawadim. Those women got them all to agree on the proposed solution, and the conflict has ceased a month ago. A few days ago, they were able to beginning the repairments for the pipelines. You can see in the slide the amount of work is just, this one is just for one village. It wasn't an easy process at all, but those women were able to do that. So allow me to explain in this quick presentation how and why those women and many others we and our amazing partners worked with and were able to be a force of peace in their communities. When we work with communities, we either work with already established initiatives or we support our partners to set up community action groups with the community volunteers to ensure women are participating in a meaningful and active way in these action groups. We use the gender-sensitive conflict analysis, which is allowing us to understand and do multiple things. So we get the right composition between men and women, ages, educational status, all that within the community action groups. What's the right time for those meetings? Is it morning? Do women need to have a chaperone, a babysitter maybe? What do they and other marginalized groups need so they can feel safe and supported? What kind of language to be used? Do they need tailored training, and on what? Do they need more gender knowledge? To what degree and why? We should be aware of key factors to take in consideration. For example, who are our allies? Who can we influence, and how and why? And most importantly, what are the gender norms that will allow them to thrive, and what norms are impairing them to be active agents that we should be aware of or aiming to change them? And this is the most important part. And how do we do this in a very conflicted, sensitive way, in a very conflict sensitive way. So to show you how it is, instead of talking about it, allow me to show you or to tell you some examples from community security program we had, which had a specific aim at increasing women meaningful participation in conflict and violence prevention. As you see in the picture, this is in Eb, a rural area. The women in the community groups decided that they wanted men to be involved in the project because it will facilitate their work, give them access to men-only spaces, and most importantly, they want to see the change happening within the men in the group, so they will influence others. And there will be a supportive power for them. But for them to meet because of the gender norms, it wasn't accessible for them to meet together. So as you see in the picture, the women were sitting or having their meetings in a separate area, and they will be texting via WhatsApp voice messages, their discussions, their requests, priorities, to the men, and vice versa. It was pre-Zoom domination era, so it was accessible by WhatsApp. And they invented, I think, the Zoom concept at that time. The gender-sensitive conflict analysis and a combination of women-only and mixed gender spaces conversations allow them to discuss their concerns, and safety issues in a freely manner and in a position to take actions too. So the projects each group proposed also included an excellent gender analysis and allowed a community group, all the community groups, to focus on women and gender and girls' needs as the community needs as well. So, as you see here, we have an example of a rehabilitation of girls' schools. The girls' school idea was in response to the lack of toilets in the school, and it was a security threat to them. It led to the students being harassed while they seeked another places to go to release themselves, and it was a very security concern to the women in that area. So Mrs. Khadija, she's a 70-year-old woman who never left her house unless it was a wedding or a funeral, the traditional way. And she was married to the aqil, or the neighborhood principal, which gave her, gave some support to the group as well. She said she would shield those girls with everything she has. She was able to raise a huge amount of money for the rehabilitation, and next, she and the other women, of course, in the group, convinced the community to fix the road to the school because it was too dangerous for the little girls as well, especially in the rainy season. Next, as you see also, there's another example, which is another community group, also in Ebb, identified the lack of access to documentation as a root cause of exclusion and structural violence. The action focused on lobbying local authorities to issue and convincing the men in the neighborhood to allow them, to allow the women in the family to get their IDs. Around 199 IDs to women were successfully issued. The real success was beyond what we thought will be. The group successfully convinced many governmental institutions to be part of the project. The Department of Civil Status lowered the fees from 5,000 riyal to 300 riyals during the conflict, during the war. So this is a very big step. They facilitated the registration process by training the groups, the women, on how to do the counting, the surveys, the registration, all the steps. They agreed to work on the afternoon, so women will be able to participate, and also to have the registration centers in the women action, in the group's neighborhood. The Office of the Ministry of Education in Ebb opened the schools and as an ID centers, so it will be near the women location. They will be able to go without traveling long distances, etc. That was one of the successes. Also, the percentage of the women who were able to pursue a higher education and get legal services and get job was 60% of those women. Thank you. I'll have to be quick. Sorry for taking much of your time. So in Aden, it was more urban, and men and women were meeting regularly in the same space, and decided that they will not have women-only spaces. The discussion were more structured and formal, and most of the action plans were around community safety in general, like anti-drugs or anti-weapon campaign, while men protected women in the groups by shielding and protecting them during house-to-house visits. We have reflected as to whether more action targeting women, youth, or other groups' needs would have come up if these groups would have the same opportunity like the other group, which is women-only meeting spaces. But we still saw example of strong women participating. For example, my favorite Ant Intisar, who visited checkpoints and armed groups and convinced her neighborhood young men to leave their weapons at her home until it is time for the shift to take and they were able to take their guns back. That lowered the risk of violence, including GBV, and she's now a great advocate for women's rights. As you see, this method allowed us and the groups to understand other forms of marginalization. For example, hearing difficulties. And they were really active in that. We have one of the participants who, she and her husband both were facing that challenge, and now they're very active, they're happy, and in her own words, she's saying she can smile again and she will raise her kid to be a strong woman, and that her husband is bringing her flowers and holding her hands in the street. Yeah, so let me just finish with the last words from Seham, who finally summarized the whole thing. Seham was from the first group that in Taz and were able to solve that problem. She said, you don't have to copy others, you don't have to imitate others or other cultures. All you need to do is build on the knowledge of your ancestors, of your female ancestors. And that is in a nutshell, is the gender-sensitive conflict approach. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alpha. That was a great and wonderful visuals to go with it, example of the challenges of doing this work, but how valuable it can be. So thanks so much. The next speaker is Stefania Menovino, who is a policy officer at the European Commission. She is a focal point for conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity, the EU conflict early warning system, and women, peace and security, and actively participated in one of our workshops. Thanks so much, Stefania. Over to you.
Sorry, I'm trying to start the video, but it's not working. Something happened.
That's okay, we understand. Just let us know when to move the slide on.
Okay, so I've been asked to talk a bit about my experience in on the Nagorno-Karabakh gender-sensitive conflict analysis. I have to sort of remind that it was part of the EU-funded project, and Conciliation Resources and Safer World were leading on this specific feature of the project, which was on gender-sensitive conflict analysis. In a sense, it was a way to test already, tested methodologies, as Safer World and Conciliation Resources always had, manuals, the handbooks. I mean, at least since I started in the EU, I always used these resources for my own work. So they were always there, always extremely valid. But somehow we tried to test it a bit in the EU context, but also with the CSO perspective. Now you can leave it on the Nagorno-Karabakh, please. So I just want to say that, I mean, I found the methodology extremely useful, and I've used it over and over again in different shapes and form in my work. So I use it in our integrating it, some of the guiding question into our conflict sensitivity and fragility training. I used it recently as we are working on a more on a mandatory requirement for conflict analysis with the new financing instrument. So I've tested it myself several times, but not necessarily in a workshop or in a formal gender conflict analysis. But I used it as a resource. We also are updating some conflict sensitivity guidance notes, and of course, these earlier materials were extremely useful. So just to say about the workshops, the workshop on Nagorno-Karabakh that was held in Georgia in October 2018. So it brought together civil society representatives and also EU representatives and representatives from EU member states. I found it was an extremely participatory methodology. There was a good, there was, I don't know how Conciliation Resource and Safer World actually invited the representatives both from Azerbaijan and Armenia. I must say the first day was absolutely, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. And I have to give credit to the organizations that through this very structured and clear methodology, that they actually created a safe space for these representatives to talk to each other and to understand each other's experiences. It was very hard, but it was extremely engaging. And I think it was very important to understand, where women and men, sort of fitted in the conflict dynamics, what were their expectations about their gender roles, how much it weighed on them, how hard it was on them. And very recently, when I saw on the news, on the, re-emergence of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and I saw, women in shelters and men called to the front line, I just remember all the participants that came to the workshop and their concerns or their fears. And somehow I have to say, let's not disregard what's called what's considered a female characteristic, which is empathy. I felt that through the workshop, through the people that I met, when I saw, I saw an older woman in a refuge saying, "We don't want this war. Who wants this war?" And I just remember the people that I met in Georgia. So I think we have to also look at the human side. It's very important. The analytical side is very important, but these are people's lives, emotions, and real losses and real tragedy. So anyway, there were some, I think, even there, there were people of different ages. It was quite inclusive. A lot also happened outside the workshop, so around the tables at lunchtime. There were some LGBT representatives, but they didn't really come out very strongly. But there were the side conversations that were important as well. So, and we're missing that terribly in this COVID-19 situation where we can't meet and do this together. Also, what struck me was the experience of young women peace builder like that leave situations of displacement on either side of the conflict, and some of them had basically lived all their life as refugees or as displaced people. So I think it's a methodology that can be, so our conflict analysis at EU level are quite top down. They're very EU restricted, if you want. And so we are currently, maybe we can go on to the next slides. We are revising at the moment. We have revised the EU guidance notes on conflict analysis. So thanks to this, the experience of these workshops and consultation with civil societies, there's a stronger gender dimensions that has been included in these guidance notes that will be soon be public. So there's still a great need, I think, in my opinion, in institutions to facilitate and increase awareness of gender experiences, conflict, fragility, and peace building. Because women are often relegated, they are not among the sectors, I call them the men with the guns and the power. So, I mean, if you don't actually factor in civil society perspective and bottom-up approaches, you're missing out really the whole gender perspective. So therefore, I would say that these methodologies, I would like to see them mainstreamed also at EU level. They're also very useful on focusing on intersectionality, and so women and men of different genders, gender identities, different orientation, different ethnicity, different locations. I also would like to, I heard a lot in this period on events on women, peace and security, and youth, peace and security. We always talk about youth, about this monolithic group, I mean, which just cannot be further from truth. And I found this tendency also among some of my EU colleagues. Youth is fundamentally male youth, no? So if we create jobs, if you keep them occupied, maybe they won't radicalize, they won't join the armed groups. So we have to also shift away from the stereotypes that have been created by also international community and not only the EU, I would like to say. So, so at the moment, we have to ensure that the new programming cycle is both gender and conflict sensitive. And I think, also, if I can go back to the Nagorno-Karabakh workshop, I think it was the methodology was also, I mean, it was conflict sensitive the way I have to say the organization actually run the workshop, which is a very important thing, and we should try and replicate that more in the EU context. We're trying to do this, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Of course, when I saw Yemen, it was very exciting what was presented. I always try to raise the issues about minimizing the risk of doing harm. So when we're looking at, so we're talking about a system analysis and power analysis, you know, obviously you are shifting dynamics, either conflict or power dynamics that are very sensitive, and that can have a backlash on women and girls, but also men and boys. So we have to be very careful that we build into our analysis a conflict sensitive and do no harm perspective. Also there are many, sorry, next slides, please. There are many opportunities going forward. We have a new programming cycle in the EU, which will determine, you know, the direction of programming for the next 7 years. So there are several opportunities of engagement with civil society, human rights defenders, on peace building and conflict prevention. We have now mandatory conflict analysis under the INDICI requirement, which is a new financing instrument. So again, there is a challenge to include also gender analysis and to carry out a gender sensitive conflict analysis. And I would like you to keep an eye on the new Gender Action Plan 3, which will come out soon, that has incorporated women, peace and security action. And there are specific recommendations also coming from a thematic evaluation, which will be public soon, on conflict prevention and peace building. There is a dissemination seminar on the 23rd of November. And one of the recommendations is about the need to work more consistently on human rights and gender mainstreaming into conflict prevention and peace building. Again, it has been mentioned already about the COVID-19 crisis. So, for example, the Spotlight initiatives, which is this multilateral initiatives, has already put up front 21 million euros for the increase in gender-based violence, domestic violence in different countries. And last but not least, I think gender-sensitive conflict analysis is also very important to inform the design of our new action documents for our new programs and projects and so on. So I would like to thank again the organizations for the methodology that they share and that they piloted, and I hope that the work will continue in some other forms. Thank you.
Wonderful, Stefania. That was perfectly on time. And our thanks again for giving us, you know, that rich sort of picture of what it's like to be in the analysis, and as you say, how it sort of echoes through the work afterwards. I found that really useful, and indeed have experienced that for myself. The final speaker is my colleague, Janet Adama Mohammed, who is the program director who leads Conciliation Resources peacebuilding work across West Africa. She's been working with groups often excluded from formal peace processes, including women and young men and women for many years now. So over to you, Janet, and thanks for sharing. Bye. Sorry, Janet, I'm just checking you're on mute.
Unmute.
Wonderful.
Sorry, sorry for that. Thank you very much. I guess you've all been focused on the screen and watching and reading text and seeing videos, and so this time I'm just going to tell the story, and I hope that my story would be accepted as one of the ways in which we have worked and made impact. Most communities in Northeast Nigeria are patriarchal, and I guess there are patriarchal societies around, and we can learn from that. And these patriarchal societies are entrenched with masculinities that define patterns of social behavior and also economic activities and social status and political positions and safety and security roles. So for the past decade or two, worsened by the insurgency, this kind of behavior has worsened, and more masculinities have taken hold of to determine the patterns of social behavior. And so we looked at how we could work in such a context. So our work has been centered around facilitating shifts and reframing and transforming complex masculinities, and how these are perpetuating violence to peaceful ways in societies, and how they can respond to violence in more inclusive ways. We were able to do this through trusted relationships with youth, women, and community leaders. And that enabled us to not only train our partners in gender-sensitive conflict analysis, but also the communities in which we work, so that we can enable the practice to be stepped to the level of them being able to take decisions, them being able to monitor, them being able to identify issues, gendered issues, and take the responsibility of addressing some of them. Using the gender conflict analysis, we identified that the role of young people transformed especially during the peak of the insurgency, with heightened roles determined by the masculinity lens in perpetuating violent behavior, which they have also not been able to deal with. So, for example, young men were told that, or young people were told that they had to come out and flex their muscles to protect communities. And to do this, they were given drugs. They took the drugs and went out, and they would tell you categorically that when they went into the field to face Boko Haram, they were able to fly in the air. And so Boko Haram was afraid of them. But what this simply meant was that they were taking too many drugs, that they did not even realize their location. They just were too brave, and they were doing things at risk, putting themselves more and more at risk. And after the war, they come back, and nobody is willing to give them the drugs. Nobody is willing to support them. And so they are used to violent behavior, and then they take the violence approach to begin to address this need. Also, a huge gap between older people and older and younger males, which sometimes deepened and strained relationships between them. So we have this intergenerational gap between younger men and older men. And again, if you flex it to women, there was a huge generational gap between younger women and older women. At the peak of the insurgency, younger women, for example, were able to run, but the older women stayed to protect the younger children. The younger women who came back were now back with different attitudes and behavior, which was against the norm. And the older women wanted to control that. And so these kinds of behavior patterns were also identified when we applied the gender-sensitive conflict analysis. Most of the people also expressed the role of vigilantes in a heroic manner, emphasizing how masculinities has worked for them. So again, you see how the protective role of men stood out. But the vigilantes are not only men, there are also female vigilantes who came out and fought fearlessly, but they were not all identified. Conflict analysis, therefore, enabled us to identify segregated roles. It helped us to identify some of the nuances that we could not have done if we did just a normal conflict analysis. And in terms of the impact, the people themselves are now able to identify gendered issues, which are often worsened with masculinity lens. And they've begun reframing. And as our colleague from Yemen was talking about the participation of women in the male-only spaces, we created a female-only space, and we called for them to tell their stories. And the men realized that the women were becoming more and more empowered, and they asked why we were working with only the women, and that what are the issues that are being discussed there. And they realized that the issues that were being discussed were community issues, relating to community safety, relating to security issues and economic well-being. So they also decided to form their space. And then we had the opportunity to bring them together to begin to talk. Because if not, they would have put the women aside. But realizing that the women were empowered, they then embraced them into their discussions. So just a subtle way of ensuring that people recognize the capacity of women around them. Now each community has taken it upon themselves to monitor changes in the community, and they try to identify these changes in the next meeting, which means that in every meeting, they will tell you, oh, this is how we have changed our behavior, and we are becoming more inclusive. So now in our meetings, we have more young people, we have more women, and they are competing amongst themselves. And they try to also highlight, for example, how many female vigilantes they now have, and how many of them are monitoring roadblocks and are able to search female travelers and so on. There are also young people who have become community leaders called the Lawans and the Bulames. Hitherto young people were not given those spaces, but now they have decided, they have seen that the young people also have the capacity to lead, and so they have started doing that. And also they have got the capacity to monitor gender-based violence and report them to organizations that we have identified with them to handle those issues, because the police are ineffective. So they send them to organizations or NGOs who are working on gender-based violence to take up the issues legally and also ensuring that victims are supported. Women and young people are now participating in decision-making, and more we feel very motivated to do more using gender-sensitive analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'm here for questions and can showcase a bit more of examples of how things have worked. The lesson here is that please engage more with the community so that they themselves can implement gender-sensitive analysis. Don't overlook them. They have the capacity to do that, and they can do it well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. And I think you're really highlighting how it really draws out these very, very complex things that unless you're deliberate about it, doing gender-sensitive conflict analysis, the information just doesn't come out for you to be able to engage with. So thank you so much for that wonderful examples. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Diana now, who will take us through into the Q&A part of the session. Thanks. Go ahead, Diana.
Thank you, Sophia, and hi everybody, I'm Diana and I work for Safe for World. Thanks for all the panelists for such great presentations and examples, which I think really help bring our methodology to life and give a flavor a little bit to everybody about what this is like and what the impact can be when we do it. I've been looking through the Q&A box and the chat box through the session, and I've selected a few of the questions that I've seen that have had also some kind of thumbs up, which means more than one person is really interested in hearing answer for those questions. And what I'll do is I'll post 3 questions to start with for all panelists to come in. And then once we finish, I'll see if we have some more time to have a second round of questions. The first question is around whether this analysis and tool can also be used and is applicable to facilitate inclusive peace building and conflict prevention, as well as women's participation at higher and national levels. So there was a question around a lot of the examples that we've given at our community level. Can you speak about how we can use this analysis to influence policy and practices at higher levels? There was another question saying, Aufa, specifically your presentation was particularly interesting. I wondered what your reflections were as an incredible woman leader on the importance of women's leadership in the Safer World Yemen team to support, encourage, and ensure that the guide is used and implemented. And in the same vein, Joelle, it says, I know that CSSF has expanded its gender advisors over the past 18 months. Externally, we have seen a dramatic increase in CSSF's gender work as a result. So could you let us know what value the gender advisors have brought to CSSF and whether the new FCDO provides an opportunity for the UK government to expand the number of experts to ensure that such tools and guides are used in both policy and programmatic change? So that's the second question around women's leadership and valuing not just women's leadership, but expertise around gender to be able to support and accompany different teams in whether it is donor organizations, INGOs, NGOs to do this work. And the third question I have as part of this first round is what do we think is the role of donors in promoting and or requiring peace building programs to do and to fund a gendered conflict analysis, a gender sensitive conflict analysis? I think Stefania spoke a little bit about how, for example, there is now requirements in the EU to do a conflict analysis, but not yet whether that is gendered or a gender analysis. So a little bit about what the role of donors can be in promoting this and taking it forward. So with those three questions, I'll leave it up to our panelists to unmute themselves and come in as you would like. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to kick off if that's useful, and I'll be briefed. So I'll start with sort of the question about the role of sort of donors. And yes, I think that we can play a very important role in terms of incentivizing, the focus on gendered analysis. And we're doing that sort of internally at the moment by really sort of basically earmarking funding. But there's also a risk when you do that you generate tokenism. Because the moment, people know, well, there's got to be the word gender somewhere in a program, or we're going to just do it because that's where the funding is. So I think as a donor, we also have to be conscious of the incentives that we present, but they have to lead to genuine impact. And that's where sort of hiring gender experts for the CSSF has been so critical, because it allows us to have the true depth of expertise. And I said earlier in my introductory remarks how important it was to be very precise, not just to use terms interchangeably, but actually go to the bottom of what can be done, what matters, where are the biases, who are the actors, and that's where the expertise has been sort of really critical across the fund, and that's why I like this tool so much. And I just want to really thank the other panelists. I've been absolutely chuffed by what I've heard, because those examples of real impact, you've told us just now, things that have changed as a result of doing this. And that goes back to the point about setting the incentives. When we can demonstrate to people that it genuinely changes the situation on the ground, it genuinely helps resolve and lower the risks of conflict, as you have just done through your very inspiring presentations, you help us further make the case and really do this, I mean, I hate the word, but this mainstreaming, and make that really sort of something that is happening across the fund. So really, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Joelle.
I just might come in to complement on the donor side. Yeah, first of all, on the policy level, I think that if you look at the EU strategic approach to women, peace and security, it certainly has included reference to the need to integrate gender analysis and conflict analysis. So whatever, I mean, I don't remember the exact wording at this moment, but I think, you know, whether you call it gender sensitive conflict analysis or having, a gender analysis and conflict analysis integrated, I think that's the spirit of what we would like ideally to be seen. So in terms of policy, has made it through into the strategic approach. It will be carried over in the Gender Action Plan 3, where there is much more focus on fragility and conflict, but also opportunities for resilience and peace. So I think it's a type of analysis that absolutely necessary. And now the new financing instruments has made it mandatory for fragile and conflict affected countries, which according to different indexes are on around 60 of the countries that we work with, to have a conflict analysis. What has changed is that we have new guidance, which again has incorporated the lessons learned, for example, from these specific EU-funded projects, and therefore there is stronger focus on bottom-up perspectives and on gender perspective. So I think there is a challenge there in such a big institution like the EU. You need to combine the bottom-up and top-down approaches and make sure, you know, that the EU is committed to gender mainstreaming. There's this new Gender Action Plan coming out now, which it will influence the next programming cycle for the next 7 years, which is the biggest, programming exercise in the world. It's millions and millions a year. So I think we need to keep an eye on these developments and everybody from their own position, and senior management buy-in is very important. So experiences like this, practical, these workshops, or the presentation on on gender conflict analysis on Yemen and Nigeria, they're just so important, and I think we need to maybe team up together to raise further awareness in EU institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. Would any other panelists like to come in on perhaps the first question around how to apply this analysis to the higher level first?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, Diana. And I think in my notes, I briefly referred to the work on Yemen and Libya. And in fact, what was really interesting there is that quite a lot of the participants in those processes were people who were doing a lot of advocacy work at the international level and also at the national level on women, peace and security issues. So they definitely use this analysis to be able to make the case as to how it makes a difference and why it matters. And I think that the sort of conceptual understanding is that once you know what the gender norms are and how that's connecting to the conflict dynamics, you can then apply it at whatever level you're working, and whether that's policy advocacy or in your practical programming. And there are particular issues that also come out in Somalia where women's organizations who were partners of Safe for World were working, who were doing advocacy on, for instance, things like a quota for how many women should be represented in parliament or some of that work. And they used this analysis to inform how they did that. Ultimately, it is about also inferencing strategies because you're trying to get into a space where you are fundamentally excluded. And so it's using this analysis to find where are those entry points, where are the pathways, and how can you make the case or put pressure or come up with strategies to access those spaces. And maybe just one small addition. I saw in the chat as well, people are quite interested in the generational dynamic of this. Just to highlight that one of the tools, one of the exercises in here, but also in the Safe World Toolkit, there are exercises around thinking about gender norms and how that makes a difference to men and women. I mean, what are the gender norms? And then for men and women, if they don't conform, or how conflict affects them, they cannot conform. What does that mean for them? And when you do those types of exercises, it's absolutely possible to break that down into different generational groups so that you can get that nuance between the differences in the different age groups and how that would affect them or what they would be facing as a result of conflict and gender norm expectations.
Thank you, Hestad. Perhaps to just add to that, if you go to the guide that I've shared the link in the chat box, a lot of the exercises of the first day are focused around intersectionality and how gender relates to other structures of power. So there's a lot of reflection around age, around, for example, different ethnic groups or religious group, depending on the context, and so on. So that's certainly something that people who are interested in this angle can look into. Janet, Alpha, is there anything you'd like to come in on this first round of questions?
Yeah, about the question of women leadership in general, not just in Safer World in any place. We know that for a meaningful participation for women, there are some conditions that needs to be there. So first, they need to be there participating. Second, they need to be heard and listened to by people there. And the third one is to be part of the decision making. If we don't have more women leadership, the decision making might be a little bit tricky. They might be there, they might be participating, there might be people hearing them, but in the actual decisions, they're not there. The more we have women leadership, the more in any space, not just Safer World or in organizations, it should be all the way. There was another question also about regarding Yemen, if this tool is applicable in some places or not. What I want to say is that this tool is flexible to be used in any context, and that's the trick. That's the main thing, that you can use it to understand the context and to understand the underlying factors, and to see what are the opportunities that you can work on. So by time and gradually, you will be able to change some of the norms, the harmful norms, or identify the enabling or positive norms, and you can work with those to change the harmful or more dangerous norms for women and girls. And this way, this tool is allowing us to understand those and take actions against for them. It's what I want to say is, don't enter with an idea of what the groups should be like, or what the things that we think that they are is actually what's on the ground. When we were in EB, we thought, oh, this is going to be horrible. We won't be able to do anything. They're so conservative, women are excluded. But so these are the examples that I shared were one of the most important, but we had so many changes happening in a small period. So the most important thing is to come with a clean slate, to listen to the community, listen to men and women, and understand the situation there, and to start from there. That's the important thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Alpha. Janet?
Yeah, I think that the tool is applicable at all levels of society. And the reason I say this is that people sitting at the national level have been socialized by the same gender norms that are applicable in communities. And so when you are using the same tool at the national level, you don't need to make it any special. You just need to allow the people to be part of this space that is analyzing the situation based on their own personal behaviors and the behaviors around their various spheres of influence. And I think that sometimes when we talk about national level, we make it too special and hierarchical, that you would think that people at that level have a different behavior. No, they have the same behavior patterns as we find in the communities. And so we should feel free to use the same tool at the different levels. And even in our research work, we use it, and we've got very good outcomes from the research work, such that even at the national level, they have not challenged them.
Thank you, Janet. I think we have time for a couple more questions before we hand over to Jonathan to close. There's a question around, it says, how helpful do we think women, peace and security commitments and national action plans have actually been to advance gender equality in a kind of transformational way and beyond just representation, women's representation? So a little bit around the WPS agenda and perhaps the links to have this type of analysis that really helps us understand those gender norms that we need to transform to create sustainable change. So that's one question. There's another question around how do we overcome the demand by men and project staff for male participation when you're trying to strengthen women's leadership or to maintain women's safe spaces? And I know that, Janet, you spoke a little bit about this. I know, Alpha, you also have some reflections around when we did it in one way or another. What have we learned on kind of taking men through this journey at community or other levels? And maybe one final question, if we have time, is how do we then use this analysis to inform programming, right? To inform, there's a few questions that are talking about how do we then mainstream this analysis into peace building program? We obviously won't have time to go into that. It's a massive question. And perhaps it's, some of you want to say something around that. But what I will say before we kind of go to the final set of answers is that this really is a foundational step. It's the first step we have to then decide how do we integrate gender meaningfully into peace building or other programs in conflict affected states, whether we want to be gender sensitive and just, you know, cause no further inequality or harm, gender responsive and respond to different needs of men, women, boys, girls, sexual gender minorities, or actually transform gender norms. And there's a lot of work after this, after the analysis, which I know a lot of organizations are doing, including CR and Safer World. So watch this space for more around that applicability for the next year or so. But I'll just now hand over to the panelists around engaging men, and then also around transformation and the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
I know that in Nigeria, the UN Women is leading its bilateral support to Nigerian government to look at WPS and set up some kind of agenda for ensuring WPS is implemented in Nigeria. But then if you leave the capital city, Abuja, and you go to other states, sometimes you hardly hear of it. This is the second time they are reviewing the agenda that has been set in Nigeria. And this time, the UN Women has invited people from the different states. Realizing this gap has invited people from the different states to participate in it. And we have a network of women mediators across Commonwealth who have had the opportunity to then participate in this space and to try to make input. So what I'm trying to say is that the WPS agenda, sometimes when it is at the government level, and I can share examples from other countries in West Africa as well, when it is taken up as an instrument at the national level by governments, it is only centered at the national level in the capital and without links to whatever happens in the regions. And that makes it difficult because the conflicts are occurring in the regions. And this is where WPS needs to take root and be applied, but yet nothing is being done there. So part of our work is to try to strengthen and empower women from conflict affected areas and to ensure that they have voice and agency and participate effectively in some of these networks. So that is just what I can say about the WPS. And maybe when we come to discuss the other question, I can contribute a bit more so that my colleague can go directly on this.
Thank you, Janet. About the men participation, I think we wouldn't be able to achieve the amount we achieved if it wasn't for the change that happened with the men in the group. They weren't accepting from the beginning the rule, and they were like, what are we doing here? What's the point of us being here? And for what? In some of the groups, in Adam, for example, we had few of them who refused even to enter the room, the same space, where women were, and they just refused to participate at the beginning. And once the training started, the workshop started, they changed so much, to the point that at the end of the project, they brought their sisters, their mothers, and their wives, which is, the Yemenis know it's not something that's happened every day, to the meetings, and they were proud to say, okay, we now understand that women are not different. They're not shame or aib. It's okay to talk to them. They do have mind as well. It was like big big lamp over there. So having them there, and having them in multiple occasions and meetings and different sessions, different settings as well, is not just the men in the groups, but also authorities, our staff, partners. It changed a lot in the understanding of the dynamics and know each other. I think some of the difficulties is knowing what exactly do we mean about women participation or women peace and security, and to get that knowledge out there and saying, actually, it's not threatening your power, it's not threatening your position, it's enhancing the community, it's for the community, it's for everyone else, it's not just women. We're not taking anything from you, we're supporting you. And just getting that to everybody in the projects and everybody in the community is a goal in itself. When we're talking about transformation, we know transformation is not something going to happen in a day or a year or even 2 years. It's those norms were developed because of so many factors, and we're not able to say just this tool is going to change. As you said, it's a gate for everybody to enter and get into a new perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Elfan. Stefania, I know you wanted to raise something as well.
Yes, just a few comments. Well, on the transformative power, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, I can only vouch, I suppose, at this stage. I mean, I've seen examples in a limited number of countries. Certainly having a national action plan helps a lot the visibility and the possibility that this agenda is actually supported, for example, and funded by international donors. So I think that's important. I would like to say that on EU level, actually EU member states engage quite a lot on the national action plans. And of course, this has also an impact on the development cooperation branches, I suppose, in different countries. So it has helped raise a lot the awareness on this topic. In terms of the male participation, I think that's what I was trying to refer to in my presentation in terms of the dilemma that gender transformative actions can bring on the ground, and the fact that why we want not to fear and not to be, threatened. This happens, there is a backlash when you're trying to shift power and gender roles and so on and so forth. So I suppose it's about having an integrated, holistic approach that looks at risks and opportunities and try to build in different dimensions where you have possibly, a phased approach to male participation. It is possible that, at the beginning maybe of a project or a program, women do not want men involved, but but at the same time, this could actually have a negative backlash on the project or program. So I think it's also about negotiating, about trying to see when it's a safe moment and there's a safe space for this to happen. I mean, frankly, many years ago, I was working in a peace mission in Guatemala, and we were having workshops with women on the peace agreements. And there was a movement supported by, UN funding and so on, which is the National Women's Forum. And women said, we know that we have to let the men in, but we're not ready yet. And so I suppose that, with all the, differences in context and projects and whatever, we have to be very conflict sensitive and also apply do no harm principles. So conflict sensitivity and do no harm sort of are the if you want, the minimum standards, and then they have to inform, and here I'm going to programming peace building actions. And for us, the gender sensitive conflict analysis has to be at, potentially at every stage of the program cycle. So we have programs sometimes that, represent a number of projects, not just one project. So, but specifically for peace building is not necessarily, for example, gender sensitive, conflict sensitive. So you need to have the gender sensitive conflict analysis to inform the program cycle. Hopefully for, of course, specific programs have to be targeted more closely, but also it could be relevant to any stage of the program cycle. So we need to try and see how we update the conflict analysis and the gender analysis, and how we try to work to integrate them together if they're done separately. Because let's face it, that's a reality for us in the EU at the moment, So you may have very good gender analysis from our, gender specialists, and then you have the conflict analysis for the conflict specialists, and the two shall never meet, but they have to meet. And I'm confident that, the new guidance notes on conflict analysis coming at EU level, it's going to help that process, and also following up on this type of initiatives from the civil society perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefania. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but please have a look at the chat box, because my colleague Sophia has just said we would really welcome any feedback you have on the guide, especially for those of you who said you have used this methodology before. What has worked, what hasn't worked? This is a live document that we've actually changed pretty much every time we've used it, and we're learning as we're going. Before closing, I'd like to now hand over to Jonathan Cohen, who is the Executive Director of Conciliation Resources, to wrap up the session.
Thanks so much, Diana, and what a wonderful session. I'd like to really start by echoing Paul's introduction at the outset of today's webinar, to say how honoured I am for Conciliation Resources to be co-hosting today's event with Safer World as part of our continuing peace-building partnership. Today's launch of our facilitation guide on gender-sensitive conflict analysis is intended to be one contribution marking the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And I think it highlights the central and fundamental role of women in building peace, building and sustaining peace and security. We celebrate this important milestone, but I think we're all also critical of the less than perfect implementation of these global standards, and conscious of how much more needs to be done. We very much see continued gender inequality as a root cause of conflict, and the evidence shows that high levels of unequal power relations and gender-based violence are associated with increased vulnerability to war, and the use of more severe forms of violence in conflict. Our experience has shown that effective peace-building interventions need to be underpinned by robust, participatory gender-sensitive conflict analysis. As we've heard today, gender-sensitive conflict analysis can help understand who are the powerful, marginalised or excluded groups, and how to more effectively work with diverse women to support inclusive peace-building. This analysis is core to preventing and transforming gendered root causes of conflict and violence in any context, and of progressing 1325. I'd very much like to thank Joelle for reiterating the importance of inclusive peace building to international security, and to Joelle for the ongoing commitment of the UK government to prioritise the women, peace and security agenda globally. My congratulations to the authors of the guide, Sophia, Hester and Diana, to the many colleagues and partners who worked with them in contributing to developing this resource. Like you, I found the presentations fascinating, and first off, I'd like to thank Stefania for the great practical example that you provided, in particular the experience of working, of participating in a gender-sensitive conflict analysis workshop, and how to progress this innovative methodology. And I really like the way you stress the importance of thoughtful facilitation that has to be attuned to the cultural dynamics of the particular context, and how useful such analysis can be to shape strategic decisions. We learned from our colleagues Alpha and Janet working in Yemen and Nigeria that, as in many other contexts around the world where we and our partners have used this approach, we found that a thorough gender-sensitive conflict analysis is vital for effective peacebuilding work. In particular, it opens up thinking about power, and that it's neither static nor linear, that it needs to be factored into ongoing work, and that this kind of analysis is not a one-time process. It's a continuous way of opening our minds to the challenges and opportunities. And I think their experience today demonstrated for me, and I hope for all of you, that analysis and action are deeply intertwined in the peace-building agenda. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of my colleagues for taking the time to be with us today. Fascinating, wonderful set of questions and comments. And of course, we weren't able to answer them all, but I think they will inform our thinking about how we go forward. And I'm sure it will create space for further conversation between many of you and our teams. I very much hope that our new facilitators guide will help many more peace builders use this methodology successfully, helping to concretely progress our global goals on women, peace and security, and fundamentally to transform gender inequalities through our peacebuilding practice. So a huge thank you to everyone who's been involved in this project. And most of all, thank you to all of you for being with us today. And it's been my pleasure to have the last word in closing today's session. So I don't know, Diana, Sophia, if there are any final thoughts from you. We've run over a tiny bit, but that's only to be expected when we have so much rich insight to share. And I'm sure this is going to be an ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everybody for joining. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.